Picture the vast Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. No land visible on the horizon. No GPS, no compass, no modern instruments of any kind. Just you, a small wooden canoe, and the infinite blue expanse that covers 1/3 of our planet's surface. Most of us would be completely lost within hours, yet thousands of years ago, Polynesian navigators crossed these very waters with nothing more than their deep understanding of nature's subtle signs. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, I'm going to take you on an extraordinary journey across the Pacific. A story that spans over 3,000 years and covers distances that would challenge even modern vessels. This isn't just a tale of remarkable seafaring. It's the story of how a people developed the most sophisticated navigation system the world has ever known, using only the stars, the swells, the flight patterns of birds, and knowledge passed down through generations of master navigators. The Polynesian navigators accomplished something that seems almost impossible to our modern minds. They discovered and settled every habitable island across 25 million square miles of ocean. From Easter Island in the east to New Zealand in the south, from Hawaii in the north to the countless atolls scattered throughout Micronesia and Melanesia, each journey was a leap of faith into the unknown, guided by an intimate knowledge of the ocean that we're only beginning to understand today. What makes their achievement even more remarkable is that they did this long before Europeans had ventured beyond the sight of their own coastlines. While Viking longships were still hugging the edges of the North Atlantic, Polynesian voyagers were already navigating open ocean passages of over 2,000 miles. They weren't just surviving these journeys. They were thriving, establishing vibrant cultures on islands separated by vast stretches of seemingly empty sea. But how did they do it? How did these master navigators find tiny specks of land in an ocean so vast that many islands are separated by distances equivalent to traveling from London to Moscow? The answer lies in a navigation system so sophisticated, so perfectly adapted to the Pacific environment, that it represents one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. Tonight, you'll discover how Polynesian children learned to read the ocean like we read books, how master navigators could determine their position by feeling the subtle patterns of waves against their canoe's hull, how they used the stars not just as distant points of light, but as a living map that guided them across thousands of miles of open water. You'll learn about the sacred knowledge of bird behavior, cloud formations, and watercolor that revealed the presence of invisible islands beyond the horizon. This is a story that begins in Southeast Asia over 4,000 years ago, when the ancestors of the Polynesian people first ventured onto the waters that would become their highway to new worlds. It's a tale of incredible courage, ingenious technology, and the gradual development of navigation techniques that allowed humans to become the most successful ocean voyagers in history. As your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows, let your mind drift back to a time when the Pacific Ocean was not a barrier but a pathway, when the horizon represented not an ending but a beginning, when small groups of brave souls loaded their double-hulled canoes with everything needed to start new lives on unknown islands, guided only by their deep understanding of the sea's hidden patterns. The story begins with the Lapita people, the ancestors of modern Polynesians, who emerged in the Western Pacific around 1500 BCE. These remarkable seafarers developed the cultural and technological foundations that would eventually carry their descendants to every corner of the Pacific. They weren't the first humans to reach the Pacific Islands, but they were the first to develop the advanced sailing and navigation techniques that made long-distance ocean voyaging not just possible, but routine. Archaeological evidence tells us that the Lapita culture originated in the Bismarck Archipelago, near modern-day Papua New Guinea. Here, among the scattered islands of Melanesia, they perfected the art of sailing and began their remarkable expansion eastward. What drove them to leave the relative safety of known waters for the uncertainty of the open ocean remains one of history's great mysteries. Perhaps it was population pressure on limited island resources. Maybe it was the restless spirit of exploration that seems to define human nature. Or it could have been environmental changes that made their traditional territories less hospitable. Whatever the motivation, by 1200 BCE, Lapita voyagers had reached Fiji, and within a few centuries, they had established settlements in Tonga and Samoa. These islands, scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean, became the launching points for even more ambitious voyages that would eventually reach every habitable island in the Pacific. The Lapita people brought with them a sophisticated package of technologies and cultural practices that would define Polynesian civilization for millennia. They introduced domesticated animals, including pigs, dogs, and chickens, to the Pacific Islands. They carried essential plants like taro, breadfruit, bananas, and coconut palms that would become the foundation of island agriculture. Most importantly, they developed the sailing and navigation techniques that would allow their descendants to cross thousands of miles of open ocean with remarkable accuracy. But perhaps their most significant innovation was the development of the double-hulled sailing canoe, the vessel that would carry Polynesian navigators across the vast Pacific. These weren't simple dugout canoes, but sophisticated sailing vessels that combined stability, speed, and cargo capacity in ways that wouldn't be matched by European shipbuilders for centuries. The basic design consisted of two parallel hulls connected by a platform or deck. This configuration provided several crucial advantages for long-distance ocean voyaging. The twin hulls made the vessel virtually unsinkable, even in heavy seas. The wide beam created by the spacing between the hulls provided excellent stability, allowing the crew to maintain course and speed even in challenging conditions. The platform between the hulls offered space for passengers, cargo, and the fresh water and food supplies necessary for voyages that might last weeks or even months. These sailing canoes, known by various names throughout Polynesia, could reach impressive speeds under favorable conditions. European explorers who encountered them in the 18th century were amazed by their performance, with some reporting speeds of over 20 knots. Captain James Cook himself described them as sailing with incredible velocity, noting that they could easily outrun his expedition ships under most conditions. But speed was just one advantage of the Polynesian sailing canoe. The shallow draft of the twin hulls allowed them to navigate safely in the coral-filled lagoons and reef passages that surrounded most Pacific islands. The flexible lashed construction absorbed the stress of heavy seas without breaking, unlike the rigid construction of European vessels. And the modular design meant that damaged sections could be repaired or replaced using materials available on remote islands. The sails themselves represented another remarkable innovation. Woven from pandanus leaves or other plant materials, they were designed to be both efficient and durable. The claw-shaped sail, in particular, was perfectly adapted to the variable wind conditions of the Pacific. Its unique shape allowed the canoe to sail closer to the wind than European square-rigged vessels, giving navigators more flexibility in choosing their course. Construction of these vessels required sophisticated knowledge of materials, design, and engineering that was passed down through generations of master canoe builders. The hulls were carefully shaped from selected trees, often breadfruit or other hardwoods that provided the right combination of strength and flexibility. The lashing that held the entire structure together was made from coconut fiber rope, twisted and braided to create cordage stronger than many modern synthetic materials. Every element of the canoe's construction was governed by traditional knowledge that had been refined over centuries of trial and error. The proportions of the hulls, the spacing between them, the placement of the mast, the shape of the steering paddles, all were precisely calculated to create vessels that could handle the unique challenges of Pacific Ocean voyaging. But having a seaworthy vessel was only the first requirement for successful long-distance navigation. The real challenge lay in finding tiny islands scattered across millions of square miles of seemingly featureless ocean. This required navigation skills so advanced, so perfectly adapted to the Pacific environment, that they represent one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. Polynesian navigation was based on what scholars call a moving island concept. Rather than thinking of their canoe as moving through a stationary ocean toward a fixed destination, navigators conceived of their vessel as remaining stationary, while the island they sought moved toward them. This mental framework allowed them to maintain their sense of position and direction, even during voyages lasting weeks or months. The foundation of this navigation system was an intimate knowledge of the stars and their movements across the night sky. Polynesian navigators memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars, creating a celestial compass that provided direction throughout the night. But they went far beyond simple star-based direction finding. They understood the seasonal movements of constellations, the relationship between star positions and latitude, and how to use multiple stellar references to maintain course even when clouds obscured parts of the sky. Different star systems guided navigators to different destinations. The constellation known as the Southern Cross pointed towards certain island groups, while other stars indicated the direction to different archipelagos. Master navigators carried in their memory detailed star maps for dozens of different routes, each carefully calibrated for specific seasons and destinations. But the stars were only visible at night, and only when skies were clear. For daytime navigation and during overcast conditions, Polynesian navigators relied on an equally sophisticated understanding of ocean swells and wave patterns. The Pacific Ocean is crisscrossed by long, regular swells generated by distant weather systems. These swells travel for thousands of miles across the open ocean, and experienced navigators could read them like highways pointing toward their destinations. Even more remarkably, navigators learned to detect the subtle wave reflections and refractions that occurred when swells encountered islands, even islands that lay beyond the visible horizon. An experienced navigator could feel these disturbances through the hull of the canoe, determining not only the direction to an unseen island, but often its approximate distance as well. Master navigators spent years training their bodies to feel these subtle wave patterns. They learned to lie down in the bottom of the canoe and sense the motion of different swells through their backs and sides. They could distinguish between the original swell, its reflection off a distant island, and the interference patterns created when multiple swells intersected. This physical sensitivity to wave motion was so highly developed that master navigators could maintain course even in complete darkness during stormy weather. Wind patterns provided another layer of navigational information. The trade winds that dominate Pacific weather blow from predictable directions during different seasons, providing a reliable compass for daytime sailing. But winds also carried information about distant land. Changes in wind direction, temperature, or humidity could indicate the presence of islands beyond the horizon. The smell of land-based vegetation or the distinctive odor of certain types of coral could travel for miles on the wind, alerting navigators to nearby islands. Perhaps most fascinating of all was the Polynesian understanding of bird behavior as a navigation aid. Different species of seabirds had different ranges and flight patterns, and master navigators memorized these behaviors as precisely as they memorized star positions. Some birds were reliable indicators of land within a certain radius. Others flew in predictable patterns between islands, creating aerial highways that navigators could follow. The time of day when birds departed from or returned to their roosts provided information about the direction and distance to their nesting islands. Frigate birds, for example, have a range of about 80 miles from their nesting sites. Spotting these birds told navigators that land was relatively close, and observing their flight direction in the morning and evening revealed the bearing to their home island. Terns and other seabirds had different ranges and behaviors, creating a complex web of avian navigation aids that extended the navigator's effective vision far beyond the horizon. The color and temperature of the water provided additional clues about position and proximity to land. Different ocean currents carried water of different colors and temperatures, creating invisible boundaries that experienced navigators could detect. Shallow water over coral reefs reflected light differently than deep ocean water, creating subtle color changes visible to trained eyes. Even the taste of the water could provide information, as freshwater runoff from high islands could be detected miles offshore. Cloud formations offered another rich source of navigational information. Clouds behaved differently over land than over open ocean, and master navigators learned to read these differences as clearly as we read road signs. The distinctive green tint of clouds reflecting light from shallow lagoons could reveal the presence of atolls beyond the horizon. Stationary clouds often formed over high islands, creating markers visible from great distances. Even the absence of clouds in certain areas could indicate the presence of land, as some islands created rain shadows or other atmospheric effects that influenced cloud formation. All of these individual navigation techniques were woven together into a comprehensive system that allowed Polynesian navigators to find their way across thousands of miles of open ocean with remarkable accuracy. But mastering this system required years of intensive training under the guidance of experienced navigators who guarded their knowledge carefully and passed it on only to worthy students. The training of a Polynesian navigator began in childhood and continued for decades. Young candidates were selected based on their intelligence, memory, and dedication to learning. They began by memorizing the names and characteristics of hundreds of stars, learning to recognize constellations in all seasons and weather conditions. They studied the movements of the sun and moon, understanding how these celestial bodies changed position throughout the year, and how their positions related to direction and latitude. Equally important was learning to read the ocean itself. Student navigators spent countless hours on the water, learning to feel the motion of different swells and to distinguish between the subtle variations that indicated direction, weather, and the presence of distant land. They studied bird behavior, learning the ranges and flight patterns of dozens of species. They memorized the colors and patterns of clouds that indicated different conditions and locations. This knowledge was not written down, but preserved entirely in human memory, passed from master to student through years of careful instruction and practice. The training was so intensive and the knowledge so complex that only a few individuals in each generation achieved the status of master navigator, capable of leading voyages to distant and previously unknown islands. As you sink deeper into sleep, imagine yourself as one of these student navigators, lying in the bottom of a sailing canoe in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, learning to feel the subtle rhythms of the waves beneath you, each motion telling a story about distant islands and ocean currents, about weather patterns and the hidden geography of the sea. The knowledge held by these master navigators was considered sacred, protected by strict protocols that governed who could learn it and how it could be shared. Different island cultures developed their own traditions around navigation training, but all shared the understanding that this knowledge was precious beyond measure. On some islands, Navigation schools were established where young men lived apart from their families for years, dedicating themselves entirely to mastering the arts of wayfinding. The most accomplished navigators often came from hereditary lines, with fathers passing their knowledge to sons across generations. But lineage alone was never enough. Each student had to prove their dedication, their ability to memorize vast amounts of information, and their sensitivity to the subtle environmental cues that made accurate navigation possible. The learning process was unlike anything we might recognize today. There were no charts or written instructions, no instruments to measure or calculate position. Everything depended on developing an almost supernatural awareness of the natural world. Students learned to sleep lightly, waking automatically to check star positions during the night. They trained their eyes to detect the faintest changes in watercolor that might indicate the presence of underwater reefs or currents. They developed such acute hearing that they could distinguish between the sounds of waves breaking on different types of shores, each telling a story about the character of nearby land. Master navigators tested their students constantly, sometimes through formal examinations, but more often through subtle challenges woven into daily life. A student might be asked to determine direction during an overcast day using only the flight patterns of birds, or they might be required to predict the weather based on cloud formations and wind patterns. These tests continued for years, ensuring that only those with true mastery achieved the status of navigator. The most advanced training took place during actual voyages, where students could apply their theoretical knowledge under real conditions. These weren't practice runs close to familiar shores, but actual expeditions to distant islands where mistakes could mean death for everyone aboard. The pressure was intense, but it created navigators whose skills were tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. As their skills developed, student navigators learned to synthesize information from multiple sources simultaneously. They might use star positions to maintain their general heading while feeling wave patterns to fine-tune their course, all while watching cloud formations for signs of distant land and monitoring bird behavior for additional confirmation of their position. This integration of different navigation techniques created a robust system that remained functional even when individual elements were obscured by weather or other conditions. The final stage of training involved learning the specific routes to different island groups, each with its own unique characteristics and challenges. These weren't simple directions, but complex navigation sequences that accounted for seasonal variations in wind and current, the behavior of different star systems throughout the year, and the specific landmarks and signs that revealed each destination. Some routes were relatively straightforward, following steady trade winds between well-known islands. Others required complex navigation through areas where currents and winds changed unpredictably, or where islands were so small and low that they remained invisible until the very last miles of the journey. The most challenging routes led to islands that had never been visited before, requiring navigators to extrapolate from their existing knowledge to find lands that existed only in theory. Once a student demonstrated mastery of these skills, they underwent formal recognition ceremonies that varied between different island cultures, but always marked their transition from apprentice to master navigator. These ceremonies were among the most important rituals in Polynesian society, acknowledging the navigator's achievement in mastering knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for entire communities. Master navigators held positions of tremendous respect and responsibility within their societies. They were consulted on matters far beyond navigation, serving as advisors on weather prediction, seasonal planning, and even spiritual matters. Their deep understanding of natural patterns made them valuable interpreters of environmental changes that affected agriculture, fishing, and other aspects of island life. But their most important role was leading the great voyages of exploration and settlement that carried Polynesian culture across the Pacific. These expeditions represented enormous investments of resources and human effort, often involving multiple canoes carrying dozens of people, along with all the plants, animals, and supplies needed to establish new communities on previously uninhabited islands. Planning for these voyages began months or even years in advance. Master navigators studied seasonal patterns to identify the optimal times for departure, when winds and currents would be most favorable for the intended route. They calculated the supplies needed for voyages that might last weeks or months, ensuring adequate fresh water, preserved food, and materials for repairing canoes during the journey. The selection of crew members was equally critical. Each person aboard had specific roles and responsibilities that could affect the success of the entire expedition. Besides the navigator and his assistants, crews included experienced sailors who could handle the canoes in heavy weather, craftsmen who could repair equipment or build shelters on arrival, and individuals knowledgeable about the plants and animals being transported to the new island. Women often played crucial roles in these voyaging communities, bringing essential knowledge about food preparation, textile production, and the care of plants and animals during the ocean crossing. Some women became skilled navigators themselves, though this was less common than male navigators due to cultural restrictions in many Polynesian societies. The actual decision to launch a major voyage was never taken lightly. Master navigators consulted with chiefs, priests, and other community leaders to ensure that conditions were appropriate not just from a navigational standpoint, but also politically and spiritually. Some voyages were motivated by population pressure on limited island resources. Others were driven by political conflicts that made emigration attractive for certain groups. Religious or spiritual guidance also influenced timing, as many Polynesian cultures believed that the gods provided signs indicating favorable times for new ventures. When all preparations were complete and conditions appeared favorable, the expedition would gather at the launching beach for departure ceremonies that blessed the voyage and honored the ancestors who had made similar journeys in earlier generations. These rituals reinforced the spiritual dimensions of ocean voyaging, acknowledging both the dangers ahead and the protection of supernatural forces that watched over brave travelers. The moment of departure marked the beginning of what might be the greatest adventure possible in the ancient world. As the canoes cleared the reef passage and headed into open ocean, those aboard committed themselves to a journey that would test every aspect of their preparation and skill. Behind them lay the familiar world of their birth island, with its known resources and established social relationships. Ahead stretched the vast Pacific, holding the promise of new lands, but also the very real possibility that they might never find anything but endless ocean. During the early stages of these voyages, while land was still visible behind them, navigators made final checks of their equipment and confirmed their initial course settings. This was the last opportunity to turn back if problems were discovered with the canoes or if weather conditions deteriorated unexpectedly. Once the home island disappeared below the horizon, the expedition was committed to completing their journey, regardless of the challenges that lay ahead. The daily routine during these long ocean passages was carefully structured to maintain both the efficiency of the voyage and the morale of the crew. Navigation duties continued around the clock, with the master navigator and his assistants taking turns monitoring stars, wave patterns, and other environmental signs. During daylight hours, they watched for birds, cloud formations, and changes in water color that might indicate the presence of land. Sailing the canoes required constant attention, adjusting sails and steering to maintain course while maximizing speed and comfort. The twin-hulled design of Polynesian sailing canoes provided excellent stability, but they still required skilled handling in heavy weather. Crews learned to work together smoothly, responding quickly to changing conditions without requiring detailed instructions from their leaders. Food and water management was critical during these extended voyages. Fresh water was precious, carefully rationed to ensure adequate supplies for the entire journey. Preserved foods included dried fish, fermented breadfruit paste, and coconuts that provided both food and liquid. Fresh fish caught during the voyage supplemented these stores, though fishing from moving canoes in open ocean required considerable skill. The psychological challenges of these voyages were as demanding as the physical ones. Days or weeks might pass without any sign of land, testing the confidence of even experienced voyagers. Master navigators had to maintain their own certainty, while also reassuring crew members who might begin to doubt the wisdom of the expedition. The ability to project confidence and leadership during these difficult periods was as important as technical navigation skills. Weather presented constant challenges and opportunities. Favorable winds could speed the voyage significantly, but storms could damage equipment, scatter multiple canoes, or drive the expedition far off course. Master navigators learned to read weather patterns days in advance, adjusting their route to take advantage of favorable conditions while avoiding dangerous storms whenever possible. The most challenging moments came when navigators had to make critical decisions with incomplete information. Cloud formations might suggest the presence of land in a particular direction, but committing to that course meant abandoning their original route with no guarantee of success. Bird sightings could indicate nearby islands, but following the birds might lead the expedition away from their intended destination. These decisions required not just technical knowledge, but also intuition and judgment developed through years of experience. As voyages progressed and navigators detected signs indicating the approach of their destination, excitement aboard the canoes would build steadily. The first confirmed sighting of land birds, the distinctive color of water over shallow reefs, or the unmistakable silhouette of an island on the horizon, represented the successful completion of navigation challenges that had tested the limits of human knowledge and courage. The approach to a new island required different skills than open ocean navigation. Coral reefs and unpredictable currents around islands created hazards that could destroy canoes within sight of their destination. Navigators had to identify safe passages through reefs, often by reading wave patterns and watercolor in conditions they had never encountered before. Landing sites had to be evaluated quickly, considering factors like beach conditions, fresh water availability, and shelter from prevailing winds. The moment when voyagers first stepped ashore on a new island marked the successful completion of one of humanity's greatest adventures. Behind them lay hundreds or thousands of miles of open ocean, crossed using only traditional knowledge and natural signs. Ahead lay the challenge of establishing a new community in an unknown environment, using the plants, animals, and cultural knowledge they had carried across the Pacific. But even as these new communities took root and flourished, the tradition of ocean voyaging continued. Master navigators trained new students, ensuring that the knowledge would survive to guide future generations. New routes were explored, connecting distant island groups and maintaining the cultural ties that linked Polynesian communities across the vast Pacific. As your breathing grows slower and deeper, let your mind drift with these ancient voyagers across the moonlit Pacific, feeling the gentle motion of the canoe beneath you, hearing the whisper of wind in the pandanus sails, watching the familiar constellations wheel overhead as they guide you toward new horizons and undiscovered islands waiting somewhere beyond the endless blue expanse. The success of these early Polynesian voyages created a foundation for one of history's most remarkable maritime civilizations. Each successful settlement became a launching point for further exploration, as new generations of navigators pushed the boundaries of the known world ever outward. The islands of Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa became the cultural heartland of Polynesia, where navigation techniques were refined and new voyaging technologies developed. From these central islands, master navigators began planning even more ambitious expeditions. The distances involved grew steadily longer, the destinations more uncertain, and the challenges more severe. Yet the Polynesian tradition of ocean voyaging not only survived but flourished, driven by a combination of practical necessity, cultural values, and the irresistible human urge to explore unknown territories. The settlement of the Marquesas Islands around 300 CE represented a crucial milestone in Polynesian expansion. Located over 1,000 miles northeast of Tahiti, the Marquesas required navigators to cross vast stretches of empty ocean with no intermediate stopping points. The successful completion of these voyages demonstrated that Polynesian navigation had reached a level of sophistication that made virtually any Pacific destination achievable. The Marquesas themselves became another launching point for further exploration. Their position in the Central Pacific made them ideal bases for expeditions heading in multiple directions. From here, navigators could reach the Society Islands to the southwest, the Tuamotu Archipelago to the southeast, or venture into the vast, unknown reaches of the northern and eastern Pacific. Archaeological evidence suggests that Polynesian voyagers reached Hawaii sometime between 300 and 800 CE, completing one of the longest and most challenging ocean passages in human history. The Hawaiian Islands lie over 2,000 miles from the nearest Polynesian settlements, requiring navigators to maintain course across empty ocean for weeks, without any intermediate landmarks or stopping points. The navigation of this route required perfect integration of all Polynesian wayfinding techniques. Star positions provided the primary compass bearing, but navigators also had to account for the seasonal movement of stellar references across such an extended journey. Ocean swells became even more critical as guides, since the regular patterns generated by distant weather systems remained detectable across the entire route. Bird navigation took on special importance during these ultra-long voyages. The golden plover, a migratory bird that travels between Alaska and various Pacific islands, provided crucial guidance for navigators heading toward Hawaii. These birds follow predictable flight paths during their seasonal migrations, creating aerial highways that experienced navigators could follow across thousands of miles of otherwise featureless ocean. The discovery and settlement of Hawaii represented more than just another successful voyage. It demonstrated that Polynesian navigation had evolved to the point where no Pacific destination was beyond reach. The techniques that carried voyagers to Hawaii could theoretically guide them to any island in the Pacific, no matter how distant or isolated. The settlement process itself revealed another dimension of Polynesian expertise. Establishing viable communities on previously uninhabited islands required far more than just successful navigation. Voyagers had to transport entire ecosystems across thousands of miles of ocean, bringing the plants, animals, and cultural knowledge necessary to create self-sustaining societies in completely new environments. The cargo carried by these settlement expeditions was carefully selected for survival during long ocean passages and successful establishment on arrival. Taro, breadfruit, bananas, coconuts, and other essential food plants had to survive weeks of salt spray and limited fresh water. Pigs, dogs, and chickens required constant care during voyages, consuming precious water and food supplies while providing no immediate benefit to the expedition. More subtle but equally important was the cultural cargo carried by these voyagers. Master craftsmen brought knowledge of canoe construction, tool-making, and other essential technologies. Priests and storytellers preserved the spiritual traditions and historical knowledge that would help new communities maintain their connection to Polynesian culture. Healers carried knowledge of medicinal plants and treatment techniques that would be crucial for community health in isolated environments. The establishment of new settlements followed patterns that had been refined through centuries of experience. Voyagers typically arrived during seasons when weather conditions were most favorable for landing and initial exploration. The first priorities were always fresh water, shelter, and security, followed by the planting of essential food crops and the construction of permanent housing. The success of these settlements depended heavily on the environmental knowledge carried by the colonists. They had to quickly learn which local plants were edible, which materials were suitable for construction, and how to adapt their traditional techniques to new conditions. The ability to modify traditional practices while maintaining cultural continuity was crucial for long-term survival. Communication between widely scattered island communities posed another challenge that Polynesian societies solved through continued voyaging. Rather than becoming isolated after initial settlement, most Polynesian communities maintained contact with their distant relatives through regular voyages that carried trade goods, news, and people between islands separated by hundreds or thousands of miles. These inter-island connections created a vast network of cultural and economic exchange that spanned much of the Pacific. Specialized products from different islands were traded across enormous distances, with volcanic glass from one archipelago, pearl shell from another, and rare feathers from remote islands all circulating through this maritime trading system. The voyages that maintained these connections required the same navigation skills as the original settlement expeditions, but they served different purposes and followed different patterns. Rather than one-way journeys to unknown destinations, these were round-trip voyages along established routes between known islands. Navigation remained challenging, but the accumulated knowledge of previous voyages provided detailed guidance for these regular connections. Master navigators who specialized in particular routes developed extraordinary familiarity with their specific sea lanes. They knew the seasonal variations in wind and current along their routes, the behavior of bird populations at different times of year, and the subtle environmental signs that indicated position at various points during the journey. This specialized knowledge allowed them to maintain regular schedules and carry larger cargoes than would have been possible for exploratory voyages. The cultural exchange facilitated by these regular voyages helped maintain Polynesian unity across vast distances. Similar languages, religious practices, and social customs persisted throughout Polynesia, despite the geographical isolation of individual island groups. Innovations developed in one archipelago could spread throughout the Pacific through the networks maintained by voyaging navigators. Marriage connections between islands were particularly important for maintaining these cultural ties. High-ranking families often arranged marriages between islands hundreds of miles apart, cementing political alliances while ensuring genetic diversity in isolated populations. These matrimonial voyages required the same navigation skills as any other long-distance journey, but they carried special cultural significance as they literally wove together the fabric of Polynesian society. Religious and ceremonial voyages represented another category of inter-island travel that demonstrated the spiritual dimensions of Polynesian navigation. Certain islands held special religious significance, attracting pilgrims from throughout the Pacific who made dangerous ocean journeys to participate in important ceremonies or visit sacred sites. These spiritual voyages reinforced the shared religious traditions that helped maintain Polynesian cultural unity. The training of navigators continued and evolved throughout this period of sustained inter-island contact. Master navigators from different islands could share knowledge and techniques, leading to refinements in navigation methods and the development of new routes. The most accomplished navigators gained reputations that extended far beyond their home islands, attracting students from throughout the Pacific who sought to learn from acknowledged masters. Competition between navigators also played a role in advancing navigation techniques. Skilled navigators took pride in their ability to complete difficult voyages quickly and safely, leading to innovations in canoe design, sail configuration, and route planning. These competitive pressures helped push Polynesian navigation to ever higher levels of sophistication. The geographical knowledge accumulated through centuries of voyaging was preserved in various forms that allowed it to be transmitted across generations. Star maps constructed from shells and sticks showed the relationships between different stellar references and their use in navigation. Chants and songs encoded information about routes, weather patterns, and navigation techniques in forms that could be memorized and preserved without written records. Some of the most sophisticated navigation aids were the stick charts used by navigators in the Marshall Islands. These ingenious devices used carefully arranged sticks to represent wave patterns around different islands, allowing navigators to study and memorize the complex swell interactions that were crucial for navigation in that region. Different types of stick charts showed wave patterns at different scales, from individual islands to entire archipelagos. The construction of these stick charts required deep understanding of both wave physics and local geography. Master navigators spent years learning to read the subtle patterns encoded in these devices, which represented one of the most abstract and sophisticated navigation tools ever developed by traditional cultures. The knowledge required to interpret stick charts was so specialized that only the most accomplished navigators could use them effectively. Traditional navigation schools reached their highest development during this period of sustained inter-island contact. The most prestigious schools attracted students from throughout the Pacific, creating international centers of navigation learning where techniques from different island groups could be compared and refined. Graduation from these schools marked a navigator as qualified to attempt the most challenging voyages to the most distant destinations. The curriculum at these schools covered far more than navigation techniques. Students learned the cultural protocols surrounding voyaging, including the ceremonies required before departure, the proper treatment of navigation equipment, and the spiritual practices that protected voyagers during dangerous ocean passages. They studied the political relationships between different islands, learning which communities were friendly to visitors and which might be hostile to strangers. Weather prediction formed another crucial component of navigator training. Master navigators developed sophisticated understanding of Pacific weather patterns, learning to predict seasonal changes and short-term weather developments that could affect voyage planning. This knowledge was particularly important for timing departures and arrivals to take advantage of favorable conditions while avoiding dangerous storms. The most advanced students learned to navigate not just to known destinations, but to locate islands that had been reported, but never visited. These theoretical voyages required navigators to extrapolate from their existing knowledge, using principles of navigation to find islands whose existence was suggested by bird flight patterns, current variations, or other environmental signs, but whose exact location remained unknown. The tradition of exploration continued throughout the classical period of Polynesian voyaging, with navigators constantly probing the edges of the known world in search of new islands. Some of these expeditions failed, with crews never returning from journeys into empty ocean. Others succeeded in finding new lands, adding to the ever-expanding map of Polynesian settlement. The discovery of Easter Island, known to its inhabitants as Rapa Nui, represents perhaps the ultimate achievement of Polynesian navigation. Located over 1,000 miles from the nearest inhabited island, Easter Island required navigators to venture farther into the southeastern Pacific than any previous expedition. The successful completion of this voyage demonstrated that Polynesian navigation techniques could guide voyagers to literally any destination in the Pacific Ocean. The isolation of Easter Island also illustrated both the capabilities and limitations of Polynesian voyaging. While navigators could reach even the most remote islands, maintaining regular contact across such enormous distances proved much more difficult. Easter Island developed its own unique culture, including the famous stone statues, partly because its extreme isolation limited contact with other Polynesian communities. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine yourself standing on a remote Pacific island, watching the sun set over an ocean that stretches endlessly toward the horizon. Knowing that somewhere beyond that vast expanse lie dozens of other islands connected by the invisible pathways known only to master navigators, each route preserved in the memory of these remarkable seafarers who transformed the Pacific from a barrier into a highway connecting far-flung communities across the world's largest ocean. The settlement of New Zealand, known to its Polynesian inhabitants as Aotearoa, marked the final major expansion of Polynesian voyaging. Located in the temperate South Pacific, New Zealand presented challenges unlike any previously encountered by Polynesian settlers. The climate was much cooler than tropical Pacific islands, requiring significant adaptations in agriculture, housing, and lifestyle. Archaeological evidence suggests that Polynesian voyagers reached New Zealand sometime between 1200 and 1300 CE, probably sailing from the Society Islands or Cook Islands. The navigation of this route required crossing over 1,000 miles of ocean into an entirely different climatic zone, where familiar environmental signs might behave differently than in tropical waters. The discovery of New Zealand demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of Polynesian culture. The settlers, who became known as the Maori, successfully modified their traditional practices to thrive in a temperate environment. They developed new agricultural techniques, adapted their architecture for colder conditions, and learned to exploit the unique resources of their new homeland while maintaining their essential Polynesian identity. The colonization of New Zealand also marked the end of the Great Age of Polynesian exploration. By 1300 CE, Polynesian navigators had discovered and settled virtually every habitable island in the Pacific Ocean. Their remarkable expansion covered an area larger than any other traditional culture had ever successfully colonized, spanning from Easter Island in the east to New Zealand in the south, from Hawaii in the north to countless small atolls scattered throughout Micronesia and Melanesia. The reasons for the end of major exploration are complex and varied between different island groups. In some areas, population pressure decreased as communities adapted to their island environments and developed sustainable practices. The discovery of all major landmasses in the Pacific meant that further exploration was likely to find only empty ocean. Climate changes during the medieval period may have affected wind and current patterns, making some traditional routes more difficult to navigate. Perhaps most importantly, the cultural motivations for exploration began to change as Polynesian societies matured and developed more complex political structures. The early period of expansion had been driven partly by social flexibility that allowed ambitious individuals to organize expeditions and establish new communities. As societies became more hierarchical and established, opportunities for this kind of individual initiative became more limited. The transition from exploration to consolidation didn't mean the end of Polynesian voyaging, but it did change its character. Inter-island voyaging continued, but it focused increasingly on maintaining connections between established communities rather than discovering new lands. Trade networks, political alliances, and cultural exchanges continued to link Polynesian communities across vast ocean distances. The techniques and traditions of navigation were preserved and transmitted, but they began to take on more ceremonial and cultural significance as their practical importance diminished. Navigation knowledge became increasingly associated with chiefly lineages and religious practices, transforming from practical skills into sacred traditions that connected communities to their voyaging ancestors. Regional variations in navigation traditions became more pronounced during this period as different island groups developed specialized techniques adapted to their particular environments. The stick charts of the Marshall Islands, the star compasses of Carolinian navigators, and the wave-reading techniques of Polynesian masters all represented different solutions to the challenge of Pacific navigation. The arrival of European explorers in the Pacific during the 18th century marked the beginning of the end for traditional Polynesian navigation. European ships with their metal hulls, compass navigation, and charts began to replace traditional voyaging canoes on many routes. The introduction of European diseases devastated many Polynesian populations, disrupting the cultural transmission of navigation knowledge. Christian missionaries often viewed traditional navigation practices as connected to pagan religious beliefs and actively discouraged their continuation. Colonial governments imposed restrictions on inter-island travel and encouraged Polynesian communities to abandon their traditional sailing vessels in favor of European-style boats. Perhaps most significantly, the colonial economy reduced the practical need for traditional voyaging. European trading ships began carrying goods and passengers between islands, making dangerous traditional voyages unnecessary for most purposes. Young Polynesians found new opportunities in European-introduced occupations and had less incentive to undergo the lengthy training required to become master navigators. The decline of traditional navigation was not uniform throughout the Pacific. Some island groups, particularly those in more remote areas, maintained their voyaging traditions well into the 20th century. The Caroline Islands, in particular, preserved sophisticated navigation techniques that continued to be practiced and transmitted to new generations of navigators. The Marshall Islands maintained their stick chart tradition, with master navigators continuing to construct and use these sophisticated wave pattern maps. The knowledge required to interpret stick charts remained alive in a few families who preserved the techniques through periods when traditional voyaging was actively discouraged by colonial authorities. In other areas, navigation knowledge survived in fragmentary form, preserved in chants, stories, and cultural practices even when active voyaging ceased. Elderly navigators retained memories of traditional techniques, waiting for opportunities to share their knowledge with younger generations who might be interested in reviving these ancient skills. The 20th century brought both continued decline and the beginnings of revival for traditional Pacific navigation. World War II disrupted many traditional communities and introduced new technologies that further reduced reliance on traditional skills. However, the war also demonstrated the strategic importance of Pacific islands and sparked new interest in traditional knowledge among both islanders and outside researchers. Anthropologists and other scholars began documenting traditional navigation techniques before they could be completely lost. These studies revealed the extraordinary sophistication of Polynesian navigation and helped preserve knowledge that might otherwise have disappeared entirely. The most significant development came in the 1970s with the beginning of the Polynesian voyaging revival movement. This grassroots effort sought to reconstruct traditional voyaging canoes and revive the navigation techniques that had guided them across the Pacific. The movement was driven partly by cultural pride and partly by a desire to prove that Polynesian navigators could indeed have accomplished the voyages described in traditional accounts. The centerpiece of this revival was the construction of the hokulea, a replica of a traditional Polynesian voyaging canoe built using traditional materials and techniques. The vessel was designed to test whether traditional navigation methods could successfully guide a voyage from Hawaii to Tahiti, retracing one of the classic Polynesian routes. The success of the hokulea voyages, guided by traditional navigators using only stars, waves, and other natural signs, dramatically demonstrated the effectiveness of Polynesian navigation techniques. These modern voyages proved that traditional methods were indeed capable of guiding accurate navigation across thousands of miles of open ocean. The voyaging revival sparked renewed interest in traditional navigation throughout the Pacific. Navigation schools were re-established on several islands, with elderly masters sharing their knowledge with new generations of students. Traditional canoe construction techniques were revived, and new voyaging vessels were built using ancient designs and methods. This cultural renaissance extended far beyond navigation itself. The voyaging revival became a symbol of Polynesian cultural pride and resilience, demonstrating that traditional knowledge systems retained their value and effectiveness even in the modern world. Young Pacific Islanders who participated in voyaging programs gained new appreciation for their cultural heritage and the achievements of their ancestors. The navigation techniques preserved and revived through these efforts revealed the true sophistication of traditional Polynesian wayfinding. Modern studies using GPS tracking and other technologies confirmed the remarkable accuracy of traditional methods, with experienced navigators able to maintain course within a few degrees across voyages lasting weeks. The integration of traditional knowledge with modern understanding has created new insights into both Pacific navigation and the broader principles of traditional environmental knowledge. Polynesian navigation represents one of humanity's most successful adaptations to a challenging environment, demonstrating how careful observation and systematic knowledge can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. As your consciousness fades into the gentle rhythms of sleep, let yourself become one with those ancient navigators, feeling the steady pulse of ocean swells beneath your canoe, reading the stories written in starlight and wave patterns, following the invisible highways that connect distant islands across the vast Pacific night. The modern revival of Polynesian navigation has revealed layers of knowledge that even dedicated scholars are still working to understand. When Master Navigator Nainoa Thompson guided the Hokulea from Hawaii to Tahiti in 1976 using only traditional techniques, he demonstrated that the ancient methods were not primitive approximations, but sophisticated systems capable of extraordinary precision. GPS tracking of his voyage showed navigational accuracy that rivaled modern instruments, with course corrections that kept the canoe within miles of its intended path across over 2,000 miles of open ocean. What makes this achievement even more remarkable is that Thompson had to reconstruct much of this knowledge from fragments. The traditional navigation schools of Hawaii had been dormant for generations, and the last master navigators had passed away decades earlier. Thompson learned from Carolinian navigator Pius Piailug, who carried forward an unbroken tradition from the Western Pacific, adapting techniques from a different ocean region to Hawaiian conditions and routes. The process of reconstruction revealed how deeply integrated traditional navigation knowledge had been. It wasn't simply a matter of memorizing star positions or wave patterns, but of developing an entirely different way of perceiving and interacting with the marine environment. Thompson described having to retrain his senses, learning to feel subtle changes in wave motion through his body, to notice cloud formations that would have been invisible to untrained eyes, to read the ocean like a vast book written in a language few people still understood. The psychological aspects of traditional navigation proved as challenging as the technical skills. Master navigators had to maintain absolute confidence in their methods during weeks of ocean travel with no external confirmation of their position. They had to make critical decisions based on subtle environmental signs while managing the fears and doubts of crew members who might panic when no land appeared on the expected horizon. Traditional navigators developed meditation-like techniques for maintaining mental clarity during these demanding voyages. They learned to quiet their minds, filtering out distractions and anxiety to focus entirely on the environmental information flowing through their senses. This mental discipline was as crucial as technical knowledge, allowing navigators to detect and interpret the faint signals that guided them across empty ocean. The revival voyages also demonstrated the remarkable seaworthiness of traditional Polynesian sailing vessels. Modern naval architects who studied these designs found sophisticated engineering principles that hadn't been fully appreciated by earlier observers. The flexible lashed construction that allowed the entire vessel to flex with heavy seas actually made it stronger than rigid construction in many conditions. The twin-hull configuration provided stability and speed that surpassed many modern sailing designs. The sailing characteristics of these traditional vessels perfectly matched the navigation techniques used to guide them. The ability to sail close to the wind gave navigators flexibility in choosing their course, while the shallow draft allowed safe passage through coral-filled lagoons. The moderate speed prevented the vessel from outrunning the navigator's ability to process environmental information, maintaining a pace that allowed careful observation of stars, waves, and other navigation signs. Modern voyages using traditional methods have revealed previously unknown aspects of Pacific navigation. Experienced navigators developed techniques for dead reckoning that allowed them to maintain accurate position estimates even during extended periods of overcast weather when stars were invisible. They learned to integrate information from multiple sources, using redundant navigation methods that ensured accuracy even when individual techniques were compromised by conditions. The mathematical sophistication underlying traditional navigation has impressed modern researchers. Polynesian navigators developed mental calculation methods for converting between different reference systems, adjusting star positions for seasonal variation, and compensating for the effects of current and wind drift. These calculations were performed entirely in memory, without any written aids or measuring instruments. The star knowledge preserved by traditional navigators encompassed far more than simple direction finding. Master navigators memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars, understanding how these positions changed throughout the year and how they related to different latitudes. They knew which stars provided reliable guidance for specific routes and seasons, creating flexible navigation systems that remained functional under varying conditions. The wave-reading techniques that allowed navigators to detect distant islands represent perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of traditional Pacific navigation. Master navigators learned to distinguish between different types of swells, identifying the original waves generated by distant weather systems and the reflected waves that bounced off islands beyond the visible horizon. They could feel these subtle patterns through the hull of their canoe, determining not only the direction to unseen land, but often its approximate distance and even its size. This sensitivity to wave motion required years of training and practice. Student navigators learned to lie in the bottom of sailing canoes, using their entire body as a sensing instrument to detect the complex interference patterns created when different swells intersected. They developed the ability to maintain this focused attention for hours at a time, reading the ocean's hidden geography through pure physical sensation. The biological knowledge that supported traditional navigation was equally sophisticated. Master navigators understood the migration patterns, feeding behaviors, and flight characteristics of dozens of seabird species. They knew which birds indicated land within specific distances, which species flew directly between islands, and how bird behavior changed with weather conditions and seasons. This ornithological expertise extended to understanding the subtle differences between species that might appear similar to untrained observers. Navigators could distinguish between birds that nested on different types of islands, using this information to determine what kind of land lay ahead. They understood the daily rhythms of different species, knowing when birds departed from and returned to their roosts, and how this information revealed the direction to their nesting sites. The meteorological knowledge of traditional navigators rivaled that of modern weather forecasters in many respects. They understood the seasonal patterns of trade winds, the formation and movement of tropical storms, and the relationship between cloud formations and weather changes. This knowledge allowed them to time their voyages to take advantage of favorable conditions while avoiding dangerous weather. Cloud reading became an art form among master navigators, who learned to interpret the subtle differences in cloud formation, color, and movement that revealed information about distant conditions. They could identify clouds that formed over land versus open ocean, clouds that reflected light from shallow lagoons, and cloud patterns that indicated the presence of islands beyond the horizon. The acoustic environment of the ocean provided another source of navigation information that traditional masters learned to interpret. They understood how the sound of waves breaking on different types of shores carried across water, how wind-generated sounds revealed weather patterns, and how the absence of normal ocean sounds might indicate the presence of land that blocked wind and wave action. Traditional navigators also developed remarkable sensitivity to water conditions that provided clues about their position and proximity to land. They could detect changes in water temperature, color, and taste that indicated different currents, the presence of freshwater runoff from high islands, or the reflection of light from shallow coral reefs. The preservation of this knowledge through oral tradition required sophisticated memory techniques that anthropologists are still studying. Navigation information was encoded in chants, stories, and ritualized performances that made abstract concepts memorable and transmissible across generations. Star positions were embedded in mythological narratives, wave patterns were preserved in dance movements, and route information was encoded in ceremonial procedures. The social structures that supported traditional navigation were as complex as the technical knowledge itself. Master navigators held positions of tremendous respect and responsibility within their communities, serving as advisors on matters ranging from weather prediction to political decisions. The lengthy training required to become a navigator created strong bonds between masters and students that lasted throughout their lives. Navigation knowledge was closely guarded, shared only with proven students who demonstrated the dedication and ability to master these demanding skills. This selectivity ensured that navigation remained effective, but also created vulnerability when cultural disruption interrupted the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. The spiritual dimensions of traditional navigation were inseparable from its practical aspects. Navigators participated in elaborate ceremonies before embarking on voyages, seeking protection from ancestral spirits and supernatural forces that were believed to influence ocean conditions. They carried sacred objects that connected them to successful navigators of the past and performed rituals during voyages to maintain spiritual protection. This integration of spiritual and practical knowledge reflected a worldview that saw the ocean as a living entity with its own consciousness and intentions. Successful navigation required not just technical skill, but also proper relationships with the spiritual forces that controlled wind, waves, and weather. Master navigators were often priests or shamans, as well as technical experts, combining roles that modern society tends to separate. The contemporary revival of traditional navigation has created new opportunities for Pacific Islander communities to reconnect with their maritime heritage. Navigation programs in schools throughout the Pacific teach young people traditional techniques while building cultural pride and environmental awareness. These programs demonstrate that ancient knowledge systems remain relevant in the modern world, offering insights that complement rather than compete with contemporary approaches. The environmental knowledge embedded in traditional navigation has proven valuable for modern conservation efforts. Traditional navigators understood ocean ecosystems in ways that modern marine biologists are only beginning to appreciate. Their knowledge of bird behavior, current patterns, and seasonal changes provides baseline information about Pacific environments before they were altered by modern human activities. Climate change research has found new relevance in traditional knowledge about weather patterns and ocean conditions. Traditional navigators observed and recorded environmental changes across centuries, creating historical records that help scientists understand long-term climate variations. Their detailed knowledge of storm patterns, current changes, and seasonal variations provides crucial data for understanding how Pacific environments are responding to global climate change. The techniques developed by traditional navigators have also influenced modern sailing and navigation methods. Ocean racing sailors have adopted traditional techniques for reading wave patterns and wind conditions, finding that these methods provide information not available through electronic instruments. Search and rescue operations have incorporated traditional knowledge about drift patterns and survival techniques developed by Pacific Island cultures. The mathematical principles underlying traditional navigation have attracted attention from educators seeking to make abstract concepts more engaging and relevant. Traditional star navigation provides concrete applications for trigonometry and spherical geometry, while wave analysis demonstrates principles of physics and mathematics in real-world contexts that students find compelling. The psychological techniques developed by traditional navigators have found applications in fields ranging from sports psychology to meditation training. The mental discipline required for traditional navigation, with its emphasis on sustained attention and environmental awareness, offers insights into human cognitive abilities that remain relevant in contemporary contexts. Modern neuroscience research has begun investigating the neurological basis for the extraordinary abilities demonstrated by traditional navigators. Studies of spatial memory, environmental perception, and multisensory integration are revealing how the human brain can develop remarkable capabilities when trained using traditional methods. The legacy of traditional Pacific navigation extends far beyond its historical importance or cultural significance. It represents a demonstration of human potential, showing how careful observation, systematic knowledge, and dedicated training can overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The techniques developed by Polynesian navigators represent solutions to navigation problems that remain relevant even in an age of satellite positioning and electronic charts. As these ancient techniques continue to be studied, practiced, and refined, they offer lessons that extend well beyond navigation itself. They demonstrate the value of traditional knowledge systems, the importance of maintaining connections to cultural heritage, and the potential for human adaptation to challenging environments. They remind us that sophisticated solutions to complex problems can emerge from careful observation of natural patterns and systematic development of human capabilities. The story of Polynesian navigation ultimately represents a triumph of human ingenuity and determination. It shows how our ancestors developed extraordinary abilities through patient observation, careful experimentation, and dedicated transmission of knowledge across generations. As you sink into the deepest levels of sleep, let yourself drift with these master navigators across the Pacific night, guided by stars and swells toward distant islands that exist at the very edges of the known world, following pathways written in starlight across the endless ocean that connected rather than divided the far-flung communities of Polynesia. The navigation traditions that carried Polynesian voyagers across the Pacific continue to inspire and inform us today, offering insights into human potential that remain as relevant now as they were centuries ago. In their remarkable achievements, we see a demonstration of what becomes possible when human observation, cultural knowledge, and individual skill combine to overcome the greatest challenges our planet can offer. Their legacy lives on not just in the specific techniques they developed, but in their proof that no ocean is too vast, no destination too distant, When human determination is guided by wisdom earned through generations of careful attention to the subtle patterns that connect us all to the natural world around us. The techniques that allowed these master navigators to cross thousands of miles of open ocean with such precision were not just individual skills, but represented a complete reimagining of humanity's relationship with the sea. While European sailors of the same era hugged coastlines and feared the open ocean, Polynesian navigators saw the Pacific as a highway connecting distant communities rather than a barrier separating them. The mental models that guided traditional navigation differed fundamentally from modern approaches. Instead of thinking in terms of fixed coordinates on a map, navigators conceived of the ocean as a dynamic system of relationships between islands, currents, winds, and celestial bodies. They understood their position not as a point on a grid, but as a location within a web of environmental connections that extended far beyond the visible horizon. This relational understanding of space allowed navigators to maintain orientation even during the most challenging conditions. When storms obscured the stars and churned the seas into chaos, experienced masters could still sense their position through subtle cues that remained detectable even in severe weather. The taste of spray carried information about distant land masses. The behavior of dolphins and other marine life revealed currents and feeding areas associated with specific regions. Even the phosphorescence of plankton disturbed by the canoe's passage could provide clues about water conditions and proximity to different ocean zones. The seasonal timing of major voyages reflected deep understanding of Pacific weather patterns that modern meteorologists are still working to fully comprehend. Traditional navigators recognized that certain routes became feasible only during specific months, when wind and current patterns aligned favorably. They understood the relationship between distant weather systems and local conditions, timing their departures to take advantage of atmospheric patterns that might persist for weeks across thousands of miles of ocean. The El Niño and La Niña cycles that dramatically affect Pacific weather were well known to traditional navigators, though they used different names and conceptual frameworks to understand these phenomena. They recognized the signs that indicated when these large-scale climate patterns were shifting and adjusted their voyage planning accordingly. This knowledge allowed them to avoid traveling during periods when normal weather patterns were disrupted, and to take advantage of years when conditions were particularly favorable for long-distance voyaging. The integration of multiple information sources that characterized traditional navigation created remarkably robust systems that remained functional even when individual elements failed. A navigator whose star observations were blocked by clouds could rely on wave patterns and bird behavior. When wave reading became difficult in confused seas, wind patterns and water conditions provided alternative guidance. This redundancy ensured that navigation remained possible under virtually any conditions short of complete sensory deprivation. The accuracy achieved through these traditional methods often exceeded what might be expected from such apparently simple techniques. Modern reconstructions of traditional voyages have demonstrated navigation errors of only a few miles across journeys of over 1,000 miles, representing precision that rivals electronic navigation systems. This accuracy resulted not from any single technique, but from the systematic integration of multiple information sources that provided continuous position updates throughout the voyage. The social organization aboard traditional voyaging canoes reflected the critical importance of navigation accuracy for survival. The navigator held ultimate authority over course decisions, with other crew members deferring to their expertise even when the chosen route seemed to contradict common sense. This authority structure ensured that navigation decisions could be made quickly without debate or second-guessing that might compromise the voyage's success. The crew selection for major voyages balanced navigation expertise with other essential skills needed for long ocean passages. Besides the master navigator and their assistants, expeditions included expert sailors who could handle the canoes in heavy weather, craftsmen capable of repairing equipment with limited materials, and individuals knowledgeable about the care of plants and animals during transport. Women often played crucial roles as keepers of seeds and cuttings, ensuring that essential crops survived the ocean crossing to establish agriculture on new islands. The psychological preparation for these voyages was as important as technical readiness. Crew members had to develop the mental resilience needed to maintain confidence during weeks of travel with no sight of land. They learned meditation and mental discipline techniques that helped them cope with the isolation and uncertainty of open ocean travel. These psychological skills were essential for maintaining crew morale and preventing panic that could lead to poor decisions or dangerous behavior. The daily routine during extended voyages was carefully structured to maintain both navigation accuracy and crew effectiveness. Navigation duties continued around the clock, with different individuals taking responsibility for monitoring environmental conditions during specific watches. Daytime observers watched for birds, cloud formations, and watercolor changes. Night watches focused on stellar observations and wave pattern monitoring. This continuous observation ensured that no important navigation information was missed. Food and water management during these voyages required sophisticated planning and rationing systems. Fresh water was the most critical limitation, carefully measured to ensure adequate supplies for the longest possible voyage duration. Preserved foods were selected for their nutritional value, storage stability, and compact packaging. Fishing during the voyage supplemented stored provisions, though catching fish from moving canoes in open ocean required considerable skill and favorable conditions. The approach to unknown islands required different navigation skills than open ocean travel. Coral reefs and shallow waters around islands created hazards that could destroy canoes within sight of their destination. Navigators had to quickly assess unfamiliar coastlines, identifying safe landing spots while avoiding dangerous reef passages. The ability to read water conditions and wave patterns around islands was crucial for safe approach and landing. The establishment of new settlements on discovered islands followed procedures refined through centuries of colonization experience. The first priorities were always fresh water sources, suitable landing beaches, and defensible locations for temporary camps. Initial exploration focused on identifying resources needed for immediate survival while assessing the island's long-term potential for permanent settlement. The adaptation of traditional practices to new environments demonstrated the flexibility of Polynesian culture. Settlers modified their agricultural techniques, architectural styles, and social organization to match local conditions while maintaining essential cultural elements that preserved their identity. This adaptability was crucial for successful colonization of islands with widely varying climates, resources, and environmental challenges. The preservation of navigation knowledge through oral tradition required sophisticated memory techniques that encoded complex information in forms that could be accurately transmitted across generations. Star positions were embedded in mythological stories that made abstract astronomical concepts memorable. Wave patterns were preserved through dance movements that physically represented the motion of different swells. Route information was encoded in ceremonial chants that contained detailed navigation instructions disguised as religious or historical narratives. The training methods used to develop navigation skills built upon these oral traditions, while providing practical experience under controlled conditions. Student navigators began their education by memorizing traditional chants and stories that contained navigation information. They progressed to observational exercises that trained their senses to detect subtle environmental changes. Advanced students participated in short voyages under close supervision before attempting longer journeys as assistant navigators. The master-student relationship and navigation training created bonds that lasted throughout the participants' lives. Masters took personal responsibility for their students' success, providing not just technical instruction, but also spiritual guidance and emotional support. Students, in turn, owed lifelong loyalty to their teachers, ensuring that navigation knowledge was preserved and transmitted with the respect and care it deserved. The spiritual dimensions of navigation training emphasized the sacred nature of the knowledge being transmitted. Students learned that navigation techniques were gifts from the ancestors and the gods, requiring proper respect and careful stewardship. This spiritual framework ensured that navigation knowledge was used responsibly and that the techniques were preserved in their original form, rather than being carelessly modified or simplified. The testing procedures used to evaluate student navigators were as sophisticated as the training methods themselves. Masters developed elaborate examinations that tested not just memorized knowledge, but also practical skills and judgment under pressure. These tests often took the form of actual voyages, where students had to demonstrate their abilities under real conditions with real consequences for failure. The most challenging tests required students to navigate to destinations they had never visited before, using only general knowledge about the route and environmental conditions. These examinations tested the students' ability to adapt their knowledge to new situations and make sound decisions with incomplete information. Success in these tests marked the transition from student to qualified navigator capable of leading independent voyages. The regional variations in navigation techniques that developed throughout the Pacific reflected adaptation to different environmental conditions and cultural preferences. Caroline Island navigators developed stick charts that represented wave patterns in abstract but highly accurate forms. Hawaiian navigators emphasized stellar observation techniques adapted to their latitude and seasonal conditions. Tahitian masters specialized in long-distance route finding across the vast spaces of central Polynesia. These regional specializations led to exchange of knowledge between different navigation traditions when masters from different islands met during inter-island voyages. The most accomplished navigators often traveled widely, learning techniques from multiple traditions and combining them into comprehensive systems that drew from the best practices of different regions. The influence of navigation traditions extended far beyond seafaring into many aspects of Polynesian culture. The same observational skills that made accurate navigation possible were applied to weather prediction, agricultural planning, and resource management. The mental discipline required for navigation influenced religious practices, leadership training, and educational methods throughout Polynesian society. The astronomical knowledge developed for navigation contributed to sophisticated calendar systems that regulated agricultural activities, religious ceremonies, and social events. The understanding of seasonal cycles that was essential for voyage planning also guided the timing of planting, harvesting, and other activities that depended on environmental conditions. The geographical knowledge accumulated through navigation voyages contributed to sophisticated understanding of Pacific geography that exceeded European knowledge of the region until well into the colonial period. Polynesian navigators understood the relationships between island groups, the patterns of winds and currents that connected distant regions, and the distribution of resources across vast ocean areas. This geographical knowledge was preserved in various forms, including oral maps that described routes between islands, resource catalogs that listed the products available from different regions, and political intelligence about the relationships between different communities. This information was as valuable as navigation techniques themselves for maintaining the trade networks and political alliances that connected Polynesian societies. The decline of traditional navigation began gradually as European contact introduced alternative transportation methods and reduced the practical need for traditional voyaging skills. Steamships and later motor vessels provided faster, more reliable transportation between islands, making dangerous traditional voyages unnecessary for most purposes. Colonial governments often restricted inter-island travel and discouraged traditional practices they viewed as primitive or dangerous. The disruption of traditional societies through disease, cultural suppression, and economic change interrupted the transmission of navigation knowledge from master to student. Young people found new opportunities in European-introduced occupations and had less incentive to undergo the lengthy training required to become traditional navigators. The knowledge that had been carefully preserved for centuries began to disappear as the last masters passed away without finding suitable students to carry on their traditions. However, fragments of traditional knowledge survived in various forms even when active navigation ceased. Elderly fishermen retained knowledge of local weather patterns and ocean conditions. Traditional ceremonies preserved astronomical observations and seasonal timing. Stories and songs contained encoded navigation information that could be decoded by those who understood the original context. The 20th century brought both continued decline and the beginnings of revival for traditional Pacific navigation. World War II disrupted many traditional communities, but also demonstrated the strategic importance of Pacific geography and sparked new interest in traditional knowledge among both islanders and outside researchers. Anthropologists began documenting navigation techniques before they could be completely lost, creating written records of knowledge that had previously existed only in human memory. The most significant development came with the Polynesian voyaging revival movement that began in the 1970s. This cultural renaissance sought to reconstruct traditional voyaging canoes and revive the navigation techniques that had guided them across the Pacific. The movement was driven by cultural pride, scholarly curiosity, and a desire to prove that traditional accounts of Polynesian voyaging were historically accurate rather than mythological. The construction of replica voyaging canoes using traditional materials and techniques required extensive research into construction methods that had been largely forgotten. Scholars worked with elderly craftsmen and studied archaeological remains to understand how traditional vessels had been built. The resulting replicas provided platforms for testing whether traditional navigation methods could successfully guide long-distance ocean voyages. The success of these reconstruction voyages proved beyond doubt that traditional navigation techniques were capable of extraordinary accuracy across vast ocean distances. Modern GPS tracking of voyages guided entirely by traditional methods showed navigation errors of only a few miles across journeys of thousands of miles, demonstrating precision that equaled or exceeded modern electronic systems. These successful voyages sparked renewed interest in traditional navigation throughout the Pacific, leading to the establishment of new navigation schools and the training of contemporary practitioners in ancient techniques. Young Pacific Islanders who participated in these programs gained new appreciation for their cultural heritage and the remarkable achievements of their ancestors. The revival movement has preserved and transmitted navigation knowledge that might otherwise have been completely lost, while adapting traditional techniques to contemporary conditions. Modern voyaging programs combine traditional navigation methods with safety equipment and communication devices that ensure crew safety while maintaining the authenticity of the navigation experience. The environmental knowledge embedded in traditional navigation has proven valuable for modern marine conservation efforts. Traditional navigators understood ocean ecosystems and environmental patterns in ways that complement modern scientific approaches. Their knowledge of bird behavior, current patterns, and seasonal changes provides baseline information about Pacific environments before they were altered by modern human activities. Climate change research has found new relevance in traditional knowledge about weather patterns and ocean conditions that extends back centuries before modern instrumental records began. Traditional observations of storm patterns, current changes, and seasonal variations provide crucial historical data for understanding how Pacific environments are responding to global climate change. The mathematical principles underlying traditional navigation have attracted attention from educators seeking to make abstract concepts more engaging and relevant to students. Traditional star navigation provides concrete applications for trigonometry and spherical geometry, while wave analysis demonstrates principles of physics in real-world contexts that students find compelling and meaningful. The psychological techniques developed by traditional navigators have found applications in fields ranging from sports psychology to meditation training. The mental discipline required for traditional navigation, with its emphasis on sustained attention and environmental awareness, offers insights into human cognitive abilities that remain relevant in contemporary contexts, where focus and concentration are increasingly challenging to maintain. As you drift toward the deepest levels of sleep, let your mind follow the wake of these master navigators across the star-scattered Pacific, feeling the ancient rhythms of wind and wave that carried them toward new horizons, guided by knowledge as vast and deep as the ocean itself, connecting distant islands in an invisible web of wisdom that transformed the world's largest sea from a barrier into a highway stretching toward infinity. The knowledge that guided these ancient navigators represented far more than technical expertise. It embodied an entirely different relationship with the natural world, one where humans existed not as conquerors of nature, but as participants in its rhythms. Each wave carried a message. Every cloud formation told a story. The flight of a single bird could reveal the presence of land beyond the horizon. This profound connection to the environment began in childhood for those destined to become navigators. Young children in traditional Polynesian societies grew up immersed in the ocean's patterns. They learned to swim before they could walk properly. They spent countless hours floating in lagoons, feeling the subtle motions of different currents against their skin. They watched the adults reading signs in the sky and sea that remained invisible to untrained eyes. The selection of future navigators was both systematic and intuitive. Elders observed children for signs of exceptional spatial awareness, remarkable memory, and most importantly, an almost mystical sensitivity to environmental changes. Some children seemed to know when storms were approaching hours before any visible signs appeared. Others could sense the presence of fish schools or detect changes in water temperature that escaped everyone else's notice. These gifted children were gradually introduced to increasingly complex observational exercises. They learned to identify different types of clouds by their subtle variations in color and texture. They memorized the seasonal movements of star patterns, starting with the brightest and most obvious constellations before progressing to dimmer stars that required careful observation to detect. The training methods developed over generations created navigators whose abilities seemed almost supernatural to outsiders. They could determine their position in the middle of the ocean by lying flat in their canoe and feeling wave patterns through their spine. They could predict weather changes days in advance by reading atmospheric signs invisible to others. They could navigate accurately during completely overcast nights when no stars were visible. Master navigators developed such acute sensitivity to their environment that they functioned almost like human instruments. Their bodies became finely tuned sensors capable of detecting the slightest variations in temperature, humidity, wave motion, and wind direction. This physical awareness was combined with vast mental databases of environmental patterns accumulated through decades of careful observation. The psychological state required for traditional navigation demanded a kind of meditative awareness that Western minds often find difficult to comprehend. Navigators had to maintain simultaneous attention to dozens of different environmental variables while suppressing the anxiety and doubt that could cloud their judgment. They learned to quiet their internal mental chatter and focus entirely on the subtle information flowing through their senses. This mental discipline was cultivated through practices that resembled meditation techniques found in various spiritual traditions. Student navigators learned breathing exercises that helped them maintain calm focus during stressful situations. They practiced concentration exercises that trained their ability to sustain attention on subtle environmental cues for extended periods. They developed visualization techniques that helped them maintain accurate mental maps of their position and course. The most advanced navigators achieved states of consciousness that allowed them to perceive environmental patterns that operated below the threshold of normal awareness. They could sense the presence of distant islands through subtle changes in wave patterns that were too faint for conscious detection. They could feel the approach of weather systems through atmospheric pressure changes that registered in their bodies before any visible signs appeared. This extraordinary sensitivity came at a cost. Master navigators often lived somewhat apart from their communities, maintaining the focused awareness that their responsibilities required. They followed dietary restrictions and behavioral protocols that preserved their ability to read environmental signs accurately. They avoided activities that might dull their senses or compromise their mental clarity. The isolation that came with mastery was balanced by the tremendous respect accorded to accomplished navigators. They were consulted on matters far beyond ocean travel, serving as advisors on weather prediction, resource management, and even spiritual guidance. Their deep understanding of natural patterns made them valuable interpreters of environmental changes that affected all aspects of island life. The knowledge possessed by master navigators was considered sacred property that belonged not to individuals, but to entire communities. The techniques and routes were held in trust for future generations, with strict protocols governing how this knowledge could be shared. Navigators who violated these protocols by sharing secrets inappropriately faced severe social sanctions and spiritual consequences. The sacred nature of navigation knowledge was reinforced through elaborate ceremonial practices that surrounded all aspects of traditional voyaging. Before any major voyage, navigators participated in purification rituals that prepared them spiritually for the challenges ahead. They made offerings to ancestral spirits and ocean deities, seeking protection and guidance for their journey. During voyages, navigators maintained spiritual practices that connected them to the supernatural forces believed to control ocean conditions. They carried sacred objects that embodied the power of successful navigators from the past. They performed daily rituals that honored the spirits of wind and wave. They followed behavioral taboos that preserved their spiritual protection throughout the journey. The integration of spiritual and practical elements in traditional navigation reflected a worldview that saw no separation between physical and metaphysical reality. The ocean was understood to be a living entity with its own consciousness and intentions. Successful navigation required not just technical skill, but also proper relationships with the spiritual forces that controlled natural phenomena. This holistic approach to navigation created remarkably robust systems that functioned effectively even under extreme conditions. When technical methods reached their limits, spiritual practices provided additional resources for maintaining course and finding land. When environmental signs became ambiguous or contradictory, ritual protocols offered guidance for making critical decisions. The social structures that supported traditional navigation were as sophisticated as the technical knowledge itself. Extended families often specialized in particular aspects of voyaging, with some lineages known for their canoe-building expertise, others for their navigation skills, and still others for their knowledge of distant islands and trade routes. These specialist families formed networks that spanned entire archipelagos, creating redundant systems for preserving and transmitting essential knowledge. If one lineage failed to produce suitable heirs to carry on their traditions, related families could step in to prevent the loss of crucial information. This distributed approach to knowledge preservation made traditional navigation remarkably resilient to the disruptions that periodically affected island communities. The political dimensions of navigation knowledge created both opportunities and tensions within traditional societies. Master navigators wielded considerable influence due to their control over inter-island communication and trade. They could facilitate or hinder political alliances by choosing which routes to use and which islands to visit. This power sometimes led to conflicts with traditional chiefs who resented the navigators' independent authority. The resolution of these tensions varied between different island groups, but most societies developed protocols that balanced the navigator's technical authority with the chief's political leadership. Navigators typically deferred to chiefly authority on matters of policy and protocol while maintaining complete control over technical decisions related to navigation and seamanship. The economic foundations of traditional navigation were as complex as its technical and social dimensions. Major voyages required enormous investments of time, labor, and resources that strained the capabilities of even wealthy communities. The construction of voyaging canoes consumed the efforts of master craftsmen for months or years. The provisioning of expeditions required careful accumulation of preserved foods, fresh water, and trade goods. These investments were justified by the potential returns from successful voyages. New islands offered fresh resources and expanded territories for growing populations. Trade expeditions could return with valuable goods unavailable in the home islands. Marriage alliances established through voyaging created political and economic connections that benefited entire communities for generations. The risks associated with traditional voyaging were equally enormous. Failed expeditions represented the total loss of valuable vessels, skilled crew members, and accumulated resources. More tragically, they meant the death of irreplaceable individuals whose knowledge and abilities could not be easily replaced. The decision to launch a major voyage was never taken lightly, requiring careful consideration of conditions, preparations, and potential outcomes. The insurance mechanisms that traditional societies developed to manage these risks included elaborate rituals for predicting voyage outcomes, protocols for minimizing dangers through proper preparation, and social systems for supporting the families of lost voyagers. These risk management strategies allowed communities to continue voyaging despite the inevitable losses that accompanied even the most carefully planned expeditions. The seasonal timing of traditional voyages reflected sophisticated understanding of Pacific weather patterns that modern meteorology is still working to fully comprehend. Navigators recognized that certain routes became feasible only during specific months when wind and current patterns aligned favorably. They understood the relationship between distant weather systems and local conditions, timing their departures to take advantage of atmospheric patterns that might persist for weeks across thousands of miles of ocean. The preparation period before major voyages often lasted for months, during which navigators monitored weather patterns, prepared equipment, and trained crew members for the challenges ahead. This extended preparation allowed them to identify optimal departure windows when conditions throughout their intended route would support successful navigation. The weather prediction techniques used by traditional navigators combined systematic observation with pattern recognition skills developed through decades of experience. They learned to read atmospheric signs that preceded major weather changes by days or weeks. They understood the relationship between ocean conditions and atmospheric patterns, using wave and current information to predict future weather developments. The accuracy of traditional weather forecasting often exceeded what might be expected from such apparently simple methods. Navigators could predict storm tracks, wind shifts, and seasonal changes with precision that rivaled modern meteorological services. This forecasting ability was crucial for voyage planning and often meant the difference between success and disaster for long-distance expeditions. As your breathing slows and your mind drifts deeper into sleep, imagine yourself lying in the bottom of a traditional voyaging canoe, feeling the gentle rise and fall of ocean swells beneath you, learning to read the secret language of wind and wave that connected distant islands across the vast Pacific darkness, guided by stars whose light had traveled across space and time to illuminate the pathways between worlds. The mathematics underlying traditional navigation were far more sophisticated than early European observers realized. Polynesian navigators developed mental calculation methods that allowed them to perform complex trigonometric computations without any written aids or measuring instruments. They could calculate course corrections, estimate distances, and determine positions using purely mental processes that integrated multiple variables simultaneously. These mathematical abilities were developed through training methods that began in childhood and continued throughout a navigator's career. Students learned to visualize geometric relationships between stars, islands, and ocean currents. They practiced mental exercises that strengthened their ability to perform calculations while maintaining attention to environmental observations. They memorized numerical relationships that allowed rapid conversion between different measurement systems and reference frameworks. The accuracy achieved through these traditional mathematical methods often surpassed what might be expected from such apparently intuitive approaches. Modern analysis of traditional navigation techniques has revealed underlying mathematical principles that are both elegant and precise. The mental models used by traditional navigators incorporated concepts that wouldn't be formalized in Western mathematics until much later periods. The linguistic frameworks that encoded navigation knowledge were as sophisticated as the mathematical principles they preserved. Traditional languages developed specialized vocabularies for describing ocean conditions, weather patterns, and navigational concepts that had no equivalents in other linguistic traditions. These technical vocabularies allowed precise communication about complex environmental phenomena and navigation procedures. The poetic structures used to preserve navigation knowledge served multiple functions beyond simple memorization aids. The rhythmic patterns of traditional chants helped navigators maintain timing during long voyages. The metaphorical language encoded multiple layers of meaning that revealed different information to practitioners at different skill levels. The narrative frameworks that embedded technical information in mythological stories created emotional connections that strengthened memory and motivated careful preservation of knowledge. The translation of traditional navigation concepts into modern languages often proves inadequate because the original frameworks encompassed ways of thinking about space, time, and environment that don't correspond to contemporary categories. Traditional navigators thought in terms of relationships and processes rather than fixed positions and measurable quantities. Their mental models emphasized dynamic interactions between multiple variables rather than static reference points. The philosophical foundations of traditional navigation reflected worldviews that integrated human activity with natural processes in ways that modern thinking often separates. Navigators understood themselves as participants in larger patterns that connected earth, sea, and sky in unified systems. Their techniques worked by aligning human intentions with environmental rhythms, rather than by imposing human will upon natural forces. This philosophical approach created navigation methods that were both highly effective and remarkably sustainable. Traditional voyaging practices enhanced, rather than depleted, the ocean environments they depended upon. The techniques developed through centuries of careful observation contributed to understanding of natural patterns rather than disrupting them. The knowledge systems that guided traditional navigation created positive feedback loops that strengthened both human capabilities and environmental awareness. The ecological knowledge embedded in traditional navigation encompassed understanding of ocean systems that modern marine science is still working to achieve. Traditional navigators understood the relationships between currents, weather patterns, marine life, and island environments in integrated ways that contemporary research is beginning to appreciate. Their knowledge of bird behavior, fish populations, and seasonal cycles provided information about ocean health that remains valuable for current conservation efforts. The conservation ethic that guided traditional voyaging reflected understanding that ocean resources were finite and required careful stewardship. Traditional societies developed protocols for managing access to fishing grounds, regulating harvesting of marine resources, and maintaining the environmental conditions that supported their voyaging lifestyle. These conservation practices ensured that traditional navigation could continue indefinitely without depleting the natural systems it depended upon. The educational methods used to transmit navigation knowledge created learning experiences that engaged multiple senses and learning styles simultaneously. Students learned through direct observation, hands-on practice, storytelling, music, dance, and ritual participation. This multimodal approach ensured that information was encoded in multiple memory systems, creating robust knowledge structures that could survive various types of disruption. The assessment techniques used to evaluate student progress were as sophisticated as the teaching methods themselves. Masters developed subtle ways of testing their students' knowledge and abilities without explicitly announcing examinations. They created situations that required students to apply their learning under realistic conditions, while providing opportunities for correction and additional instruction when needed. The graduation ceremonies that marked the transition from student to qualified navigator served multiple functions within traditional societies. They publicly acknowledged the individual's achievement while formally recognizing their new responsibilities to the community. They created opportunities for knowledge sharing between different lineages and regions. They reinforced the sacred nature of navigation knowledge while celebrating its successful transmission to new generations. The continuing influence of traditional navigation extends far beyond its historical importance or cultural significance. Modern research has revealed that the cognitive abilities developed through traditional training may represent optimal ways of processing certain types of environmental information. The spatial reasoning skills, pattern recognition abilities, and sensory integration techniques developed by traditional navigators offer insights into human potential that remain relevant for contemporary applications. The environmental awareness cultivated through traditional navigation training provides models for sustainable relationships with natural systems that have broader relevance for addressing modern ecological challenges. The integrated understanding of ocean systems developed by traditional navigators offers perspectives that complement and enhance contemporary marine science approaches. As sleep deepens and your consciousness drifts with the ancient currents of the Pacific, feel yourself becoming one with those master navigators who read the ocean like an open book. Their knowledge flowing through generations like the eternal circulation of currents that connect all waters, all islands, all peoples in the vast embrace of the sea that holds within its depths the memory of every voyage ever made, every island ever discovered, every star that ever guided a lonely canoe across the infinite blue highways of the Pacific night. The legacy of these ancient navigators continues to ripple across time like the wake of their great voyaging canoes. In laboratories and classrooms around the world, researchers study the extraordinary mental abilities that traditional navigation required and developed. Neuroscientists have discovered that the brains of people trained in traditional wayfinding show unique patterns of development, with enhanced spatial processing areas and strengthened connections between sensory regions that allow for the integration of multiple environmental signals. These findings suggest that the human brain possesses latent capabilities that can be awakened through the right kind of training and practice. The navigators didn't simply learn techniques. They fundamentally altered their neural architecture through years of intensive observation and environmental interaction. Their enhanced abilities weren't supernatural gifts, but rather the natural result of pushing human cognitive potential to its limits through systematic development. Modern aviation and maritime industries have begun incorporating elements of traditional navigation training into their educational programs. Pilots learn to read atmospheric conditions using principles derived from Polynesian cloud interpretation. Ship captains study traditional methods for detecting land masses beyond the visible horizon. These applications demonstrate that ancient knowledge systems continue to offer practical value even in an age of sophisticated electronic navigation aids. The psychological research emerging from studies of traditional navigation has revealed important insights about human attention and awareness. The meditative states that navigators cultivated to maintain environmental sensitivity share characteristics with mindfulness practices that modern psychology has found beneficial for mental health and cognitive performance. The ability to sustain focused attention while remaining open to subtle environmental changes represents a form of consciousness that contemporary society rarely develops or values. Educational researchers have found that traditional navigation training methods can dramatically improve students' spatial reasoning abilities, mathematical understanding, and environmental awareness. Children who participate in traditional navigation programs show enhanced performance in subjects ranging from geometry to geography to physics. The hands-on, experiential learning approach that characterizes traditional training appears to engage cognitive processes that conventional classroom instruction often leaves underdeveloped. The environmental knowledge preserved in traditional navigation systems has become increasingly valuable as climate change alters ocean patterns that have remained stable for centuries. Traditional observations of seasonal variations, storm patterns, and current changes provide baseline data that help scientists understand how marine systems are responding to global warming. The long-term perspective embedded in traditional knowledge offers insights that instrumental records spanning only decades cannot provide. Marine conservation efforts have embraced traditional knowledge about ocean ecosystems, finding that indigenous understanding of marine life patterns often reveals information unavailable through modern scientific methods. Traditional navigators understood the relationships between different species, seasonal migrations, and environmental conditions in ways that complement contemporary marine biology. Their knowledge of fish behavior, coral reef ecology, and ocean chemistry provides crucial information for protecting marine environments. The revival of traditional navigation has created new opportunities for cultural exchange and understanding between indigenous Pacific communities and the broader world. Navigation schools established throughout Polynesia now attract students from many cultural backgrounds who seek to learn these ancient techniques. These programs create bridges between traditional and modern knowledge systems while preserving cultural practices that might otherwise disappear. The construction of traditional voyaging canoes has itself become a form of cultural education that transmits far more than boat-building skills. Students learn about sustainable resource management, traditional craftsmanship, and the social cooperation required for major community projects. The process of building a voyaging canoe according to traditional methods requires the same patience, attention to detail, and respect for natural materials that characterized traditional navigation training. The materials used in traditional canoe construction have attracted attention from modern materials scientists studying sustainable alternatives to synthetic composites. The plant fibers used for lashing, the natural resins used for waterproofing, And the wood selection criteria developed through centuries of experience offer insights into creating strong, flexible, and environmentally friendly construction materials. The social organization required for traditional voyaging has provided models for contemporary team building and leadership development programs. The cooperation between navigator, crew, and passengers during long ocean voyages required forms of communication, conflict resolution, and shared decision-making that remain relevant for modern organizations. The leadership style of traditional navigators, combining absolute authority in technical matters with democratic consultation on broader decisions, offers insights for contemporary management approaches. The risk management strategies developed by traditional voyaging societies have influenced modern approaches to expedition planning and emergency preparedness. Traditional methods for assessing weather conditions, evaluating equipment readiness, and preparing for various contingencies demonstrate systematic approaches to managing uncertainty that remain applicable to contemporary ventures involving significant risks. The economic principles underlying traditional voyaging expeditions have provided insights for understanding sustainable development and resource allocation in island environments. Traditional societies developed sophisticated methods for balancing the costs and benefits of major voyaging projects, while ensuring that community resources weren't depleted by ambitious expeditions. These economic models offer lessons for contemporary development projects in island nations and other resource-limited environments. The astronomical knowledge preserved in traditional navigation systems has contributed to efforts to maintain awareness of natural sky patterns in an age when light pollution obscures the stars for most of humanity. Planetariums and astronomy education programs now incorporate traditional constellation knowledge and seasonal observations that connect modern students with the cosmic awareness that guided ancient navigators. The mathematical concepts embedded in traditional navigation have found applications in fields ranging from computer science to architectural design. The spatial reasoning abilities required for traditional wayfinding translate into enhanced capabilities for three-dimensional modeling, pattern recognition, and complex problem-solving. The mental calculation techniques developed by navigators offer insights into non-linear thinking processes that remain valuable for contemporary applications. The artistic traditions that emerged from voyaging cultures continue to influence contemporary Pacific Island art, music, and dance. The aesthetic sensibilities developed through intimate observation of ocean patterns, sky formations, and natural rhythms found expression in cultural forms that preserve and transmit environmental knowledge through creative practice. These artistic traditions demonstrate how technical knowledge and creative expression can be integrated in ways that strengthen both. The spiritual dimensions of traditional navigation have attracted attention from religious scholars and practitioners seeking to understand how technical expertise and spiritual practice can be integrated. The rituals and ceremonies that surrounded traditional voyaging demonstrate how practical activities can be imbued with sacred meaning that enhances both their effectiveness and their cultural significance. The meditation techniques developed by traditional navigators have been adapted for use in various therapeutic and educational contexts. The ability to quiet mental activity while maintaining heightened environmental awareness represents a form of consciousness that has applications beyond navigation. These techniques have been incorporated into stress reduction programs, attention training methods, and therapeutic interventions for various psychological conditions. The dietary and lifestyle practices that traditional navigators followed to maintain their sensory acuity have influenced contemporary approaches to optimizing human performance. The understanding that physical condition directly affects cognitive abilities led traditional societies to develop protocols for maintaining the health and awareness needed for successful navigation. These practices offer insights for contemporary efforts to enhance human capabilities through lifestyle modifications. The linguistic analysis of traditional navigation terminology has revealed sophisticated conceptual frameworks for understanding spatial relationships, temporal patterns, and environmental processes. The vocabulary developed by traditional navigators demonstrates how language shapes perception and how technical expertise requires precise terminology for describing complex phenomena. These linguistic studies contribute to understanding how different cultures conceptualize space, time, and natural processes. The preservation efforts that have maintained traditional navigation knowledge demonstrate the importance of cultural continuity for maintaining specialized forms of expertise. The methods used to transmit complex technical knowledge across generations without written records offer insights for contemporary efforts to preserve endangered knowledge systems and cultural practices. The adaptation of traditional navigation techniques to modern contexts has created new forms of hybrid knowledge that combine ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding. Modern practitioners of traditional navigation often use GPS devices for safety, while relying entirely on traditional methods for actual navigation. This approach allows for the preservation and practice of traditional techniques, while acknowledging contemporary safety requirements. The research methodologies developed for studying traditional navigation have influenced anthropological and psychological approaches to understanding traditional knowledge systems. The recognition that traditional techniques often embody sophisticated understanding that may not be immediately apparent to outside observers has led to more respectful and systematic approaches to documenting indigenous knowledge. The international recognition of traditional navigation as a significant human achievement has contributed to broader appreciation of indigenous knowledge systems and their contributions to human civilization. The inclusion of traditional Pacific navigation in UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage List acknowledges its global significance and supports efforts to preserve and transmit this knowledge to future generations. As the deepest currents of sleep carry you toward complete rest, let your mind drift with the eternal patterns that guided those ancient voyagers, feeling the rhythm of waves that have circled the Pacific for millions of years. Carrying within their motion the memory of every canoe that ever rode their crests, every navigator who ever read their secret messages, every island that ever sent its influence rippling across the vast blue distances that connect all shores in the endless dance of ocean and sky that continues even now as you sink into the profound stillness that mirrors the deep peace found at the heart of the sea itself. The wisdom embedded in traditional Pacific navigation represents more than historical achievement or cultural heritage. It demonstrates the extraordinary heights that human capability can reach when systematic observation, dedicated training, and cultural continuity combine to address fundamental challenges. The navigators who crossed the Pacific using only stars and swells achieved something that speaks to the deepest aspects of human potential and our relationship with the natural world. Their accomplishment reminds us that sophisticated solutions to complex problems can emerge from careful attention to natural patterns and systematic development of human abilities. In an age when electronic devices mediate most of our interactions with the environment, the traditional navigator's direct engagement with natural phenomena offers a model for maintaining meaningful connections with the world around us. The integration of technical expertise with spiritual practice that characterized traditional navigation suggests possibilities for approaching contemporary challenges with both analytical rigor and deeper wisdom. The navigators understood that successful voyaging required not just technical knowledge, but also proper relationships with the forces beyond human control that ultimately determine the success or failure of any venture. Their story continues to unfold as new generations discover the relevance of ancient wisdom for contemporary challenges. The principles that guided voyaging canoes across the Pacific continue to offer guidance for navigating the complex currents of modern life. the same attention to subtle patterns, the same integration of multiple information sources, the same balance of confidence and humility that served traditional navigators remain valuable for anyone seeking to find their way through uncertain territories toward distant goals. In the end, the greatest gift of the traditional Pacific navigators may be their demonstration that no challenge is too great when human determination is guided by wisdom earned through generations of careful observation and respectful engagement with the natural world. Their legacy lives on in every person who looks up at the stars and wonders about the journeys they might guide, in every individual who learns to read the subtle signs that nature constantly provides, and in every community that chooses to preserve and transmit the hard-won wisdom of their ancestors to future generations, who will face their own voyages across unknown seas toward undiscovered islands of possibility and hope. The revival of traditional navigation in the modern era has revealed layers of knowledge that continue to astound researchers and practitioners alike. When contemporary navigators first attempted to reconstruct ancient voyaging techniques, they discovered that what appeared to be simple methods actually required extraordinary sensory development and mental discipline that took years to achieve. The process of learning traditional navigation begins with unlearning modern assumptions about how humans interact with their environment. Students must develop what traditional practitioners called ocean sense, an integrated awareness that combines information from multiple sensory channels into a coherent understanding of position and direction. This awareness operates below the threshold of conscious thought, allowing navigators to respond to environmental changes before they become consciously apparent. The development of ocean sense requires systematic training that gradually expands the student's perceptual abilities. Beginning students learn to distinguish between different types of wave motion by lying motionless in shallow water for hours at a time. They practice identifying subtle changes in water temperature, salinity, and color that indicate proximity to land or changes in current patterns. They develop enhanced night vision through exercises performed in complete darkness, learning to detect the faintest variations in star brightness and position. Advanced students progress to exercises that integrate multiple sensory inputs simultaneously. They learn to maintain awareness of wave patterns while observing cloud formations, tracking bird flight paths, and monitoring wind direction changes. This multitasking ability allows experienced navigators to process vast amounts of environmental information continuously while maintaining course toward distant destinations. The mental mapping techniques used by traditional navigators represented a complete reimagining of spatial awareness. Rather than thinking in terms of fixed coordinates on a static chart, navigators maintained dynamic mental models that constantly updated based on changing conditions. Their internal maps resembled living systems that grew and evolved throughout each voyage, incorporating new information while maintaining overall coherence and accuracy. These mental maps were constructed using reference systems that had no equivalent in modern navigation. Traditional navigators organized their understanding around the concept of moving islands, where their canoe remained stationary while their destination approached them across the sea. This framework allowed them to maintain spatial orientation even during voyages lasting weeks without any visual contact with land. The star knowledge that formed the foundation of traditional navigation encompassed far more than simple direction finding. Master navigators memorized the rising and setting points of over 200 stars, understanding how these positions changed throughout the year and varied with latitude. They knew which stars provided reliable guidance during different seasons and could substitute alternative stellar references when their primary guides were obscured by clouds. The most accomplished navigators developed the ability to maintain accurate course even when most of the sky was overcast. They learned to detect the faint glow of stars through thin cloud cover and to estimate positions based on the movement of partially visible constellations. These techniques required extraordinary visual sensitivity combined with sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Wave reading represented perhaps the most mysterious aspect of traditional navigation to outside observers. The ability to detect distant islands through subtle variations in wave patterns seemed almost supernatural to early European explorers who witnessed these demonstrations. Modern research has revealed the physical principles underlying these techniques, but the practical mastery still requires years of dedicated training that few contemporary practitioners have achieved. The ocean surface carries information about distant landmasses through complex interference patterns created when swells encounter islands and reflect back toward the open sea. These reflected waves interact with the original swells to create subtle variations in wave height, direction, and timing that experienced navigators can detect through physical contact with their vessel's hull. The patterns are so faint that they remain below the threshold of normal human perception, requiring specialized training to detect and interpret. Master wave readers developed extraordinary sensitivity to these subtle patterns through exercises that bordered on meditation. They learned to enter states of consciousness where their entire attention focused on the physical sensations transmitted through their canoe's hull. In these heightened states of awareness, they could distinguish between waves that had traveled uninterrupted across thousands of miles of open ocean and those that carried the faint signature of distant islands. The interpretation of wave patterns required understanding complex principles of wave physics that traditional navigators learned through practical experience rather than theoretical study. They understood how different types of seafloor affected wave behavior, how island size and shape influenced reflection patterns, and how seasonal changes in weather patterns altered the characteristics of long-distance swells. The bird navigation techniques developed by Pacific cultures represented another dimension of environmental awareness that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Traditional navigators understood the behavior patterns of dozens of seabird species with such precision that they could determine their position relative to distant islands based on subtle variations in bird behavior and flight patterns. Different bird species provided information at different scales and distances. Some birds indicated land within 20 miles, while others suggested islands within 100 miles. The most valuable were species that flew directly between specific islands, creating aerial highways that navigators could follow across vast stretches of otherwise featureless ocean. The timing of bird movements provided additional information, as many species followed predictable schedules when traveling between feeding areas and nesting sites. The observation of bird behavior required patience and systematic attention that few people in the modern world develop. Navigators learned to distinguish between the flight patterns of birds heading to sea to feed and those returning to land to roost. They understood how weather conditions affected bird behavior and could predict changes in bird activity based on atmospheric conditions that preceded storms or seasonal shifts. Master navigators developed such detailed knowledge of bird ecology that they could identify individual islands based on the species composition of birds encountered at different distances. Each island supported slightly different bird populations depending on its habitat characteristics, elevation, and available food sources. This knowledge allowed navigators to determine not just the direction to land, but often the specific identity of nearby islands. The cloud reading techniques that supplemented stellar and wave navigation required equally sophisticated understanding of atmospheric phenomena. Traditional navigators learned to interpret dozens of different cloud formations, each providing specific information about weather conditions, wind patterns, and the presence of distant land. They understood how clouds formed differently over land and water, how shallow lagoons affected cloud color through light reflection, and how mountain islands created distinctive cloud patterns through orographic effects. The most subtle cloud signs required extraordinary visual sensitivity to detect. The faint green tint of clouds reflecting light from shallow coral lagoons could be detected only by navigators who had trained their eyes through years of systematic observation. The stationary clouds that often formed over high islands created landmarks visible from distances far greater than the islands themselves. But recognizing these formations required understanding complex relationships between topography, weather patterns, and atmospheric conditions. Traditional navigators also learned to read the absence of clouds as information about their position. Some islands created rain shadows or other atmospheric effects that prevented normal cloud formation in specific areas. The recognition of these negative signs required the same systematic observation and pattern recognition skills as identifying positive indicators of land. The integration of all these different information sources created navigation systems of remarkable robustness and accuracy. When stars were obscured by clouds, navigators relied on wave patterns and bird behavior. When wave reading became difficult in confused seas, cloud formations and wind patterns provided alternative guidance. This redundancy ensured that navigation remained possible under virtually any conditions that might be encountered during Pacific voyaging. The synthesis of multiple information sources required mental abilities that extended far beyond normal human experience. Navigators had to maintain simultaneous awareness of dozens of different environmental variables while performing the complex calculations needed to determine position and course corrections. They accomplished this through mental training techniques that resembled advanced meditation practices, developing states of consciousness that allowed extraordinary information processing capabilities. The accuracy achieved through traditional methods consistently amazed modern researchers who tracked replica voyages using GPS technology. Navigators using only traditional techniques maintained course within a few degrees across voyages of over 1,000 miles, achieving precision that equaled or exceeded early electronic navigation systems. This accuracy resulted from the systematic integration of multiple information sources rather than reliance on any single technique. The training required to develop these navigation abilities created individuals whose relationship with the natural environment differed fundamentally from modern human experience. Traditional navigators lived in constant awareness of subtle environmental patterns that remained invisible to untrained observers. They developed what might be described as an expanded sensory reality, where information flowed continuously from sources that ordinary consciousness couldn't access. This expanded awareness came at the cost of certain modern conveniences and distractions. Traditional navigators followed lifestyle protocols that preserved their sensory acuity and mental clarity. They avoided activities that might dull their perception or compromise their ability to detect the subtle environmental cues that successful navigation required. Their entire lives were organized around maintaining the extraordinary capabilities that their responsibilities demanded. The social recognition accorded to master navigators reflected their community's understanding of the remarkable abilities these individuals had developed. They were consulted on matters far beyond navigation, serving as interpreters of natural patterns that affected agriculture, fishing, weather prediction, and spiritual practices. Their deep understanding of environmental systems made them valuable advisors on virtually any activity that depended on natural conditions. The preservation of navigation knowledge through oral tradition required memory techniques that modern educators are only beginning to understand. Traditional cultures developed sophisticated methods for encoding complex technical information in forms that could be accurately transmitted across generations without written records. These techniques created remarkably stable knowledge preservation systems that maintained accuracy over centuries of transmission. The ceremonies and rituals that surrounded traditional navigation served multiple functions beyond their obvious spiritual significance. They provided systematic methods for reviewing and confirming navigation knowledge, creating regular opportunities for masters to test their students and for the community to verify that essential information was being preserved accurately. The ceremonial framework also reinforced the sacred nature of navigation knowledge, ensuring that it was treated with the respect and care necessary for long-term preservation. As your consciousness drifts toward the deepest levels of sleep, imagine yourself as one of these remarkable navigators. Your awareness expanded to encompass the vast patterns that connect sea and sky, feeling the gentle pulse of ancient swells that have circled the Pacific for countless generations, carrying within their rhythm the accumulated wisdom of all who have learned to read the ocean's secret language, guiding you toward dreams as vast and mysterious as the star-scattered waters that stretch endlessly toward tomorrow's horizon. The knowledge that flows through these ancient pathways continues to teach us about human potential and our relationship with the natural world. In learning how traditional navigators achieved such extraordinary abilities, we discover possibilities for our own development that extend far beyond navigation itself. Their story reminds us that careful attention to natural patterns, systematic development of human capabilities, and respectful engagement with environmental forces can achieve what seems impossible to ordinary consciousness. As sleep carries you deeper into rest, let the wisdom of these master navigators guide your dreams across infinite oceans of possibility, where every star is a teacher, every wave carries a message, and every breath of wind whispers the secrets of finding your way home through the vast, mysterious darkness that connects all journeys, all destinations, all souls seeking their true course through the endless night that holds within its depths the memory of every voyage ever made toward the light of understanding that shines beyond all horizons. The profound legacy of these master navigators extends beyond their remarkable technical achievements into the realm of human consciousness itself. Modern neuroscience has begun to uncover how the intensive training required for traditional navigation literally rewired the brains of these ancient seafarers, creating neural pathways that allowed them to process environmental information in ways that seem almost miraculous to contemporary understanding. Brain imaging studies of modern practitioners who have undergone traditional navigation training reveal enlarged hippocampal regions associated with spatial memory, enhanced connectivity between sensory processing areas, and increased gray matter density in regions responsible for integrating multiple streams of information simultaneously. These changes suggest that the human brain possesses remarkable plasticity that can be shaped through sustained practice into configurations that unlock extraordinary perceptual abilities. The implications of these findings extend far beyond navigation into fields ranging from education to therapy to human performance enhancement. If traditional training methods can develop such remarkable spatial awareness and environmental sensitivity, what other latent human capabilities might be awakened through similar approaches? The navigators' achievements suggest that the boundaries we typically accept for human perception and cognition may be far more flexible than we imagine. Contemporary applications of traditional navigation principles have emerged in unexpected fields. Military Special Forces units study traditional wayfinding techniques to maintain operational effectiveness when electronic systems fail or become compromised. Emergency responders learn traditional weather reading skills to predict dangerous conditions in remote areas where meteorological data may be unavailable. Search and rescue teams incorporate traditional tracking methods that rely on environmental signs rather than technological aids. The therapeutic applications of navigation training have shown remarkable promise for treating various cognitive and psychological conditions. Veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress report significant improvement after participating in traditional wayfinding programs that require sustained attention to natural phenomena. The meditative aspects of environmental observation appear to help calm hypervigilant nervous systems while rebuilding confidence in personal abilities and environmental awareness. Children with attention difficulties often show dramatic improvement after exposure to traditional navigation training methods. The multisensory, experiential nature of this learning engages cognitive processes that conventional classroom instruction may leave underdeveloped. The requirement for sustained observation of subtle environmental changes naturally builds concentration skills while providing immediate feedback about the accuracy of observations. The environmental awareness cultivated through traditional navigation training offers crucial insights for addressing contemporary ecological challenges. As climate change alters weather patterns and ocean systems that have remained stable for millennia, the long-term observational knowledge preserved in traditional navigation systems provides invaluable baseline data for understanding these changes. Traditional navigators noticed and recorded environmental variations across centuries, creating historical records that complement modern instrumental measurements. Marine conservation efforts increasingly recognize the value of traditional ecological knowledge embedded in navigation systems. Traditional navigators understood ocean ecosystems as integrated systems, where changes in one component affected all others. Their observations of fish behavior, bird populations, coral reef health, and water quality provide insights that purely scientific approaches might miss. This holistic understanding proves essential for developing effective conservation strategies that account for the complex interactions within marine environments. The sustainable practices that characterize traditional voyaging cultures offer models for contemporary efforts to balance human activities with environmental protection. Traditional societies developed sophisticated protocols for managing their impact on ocean resources while maintaining the knowledge and capabilities needed for continued voyaging. These practices demonstrate that advanced technical abilities and environmental stewardship can coexist when guided by appropriate cultural values and long-term thinking. The revival of traditional navigation has created new forms of cultural exchange that bridge ancient wisdom and modern understanding. International programs now bring together master navigators from different Pacific cultures to share knowledge and techniques that might otherwise remain isolated within specific communities. These exchanges reveal both the common principles underlying all traditional navigation and the unique innovations developed by different cultures in response to their specific environmental conditions. The educational impact of traditional navigation programs extends far beyond the specific skills being taught. Students who participate in these programs develop enhanced spatial reasoning abilities, improved pattern recognition skills, and greater environmental awareness that benefits their performance in many academic subjects. The hands-on, experiential learning methods that characterize traditional training engage multiple learning styles simultaneously, creating robust knowledge structures that prove more durable than information acquired through conventional instruction. The philosophical dimensions of traditional navigation continue to influence contemporary thinking about human-environment relationships. The navigators' understanding of themselves as participants in larger natural systems rather than controllers of environmental forces offers alternative perspectives on sustainability, technology, and human development. Their integration of technical expertise with spiritual practice suggests possibilities for approaching contemporary challenges with both analytical rigor and deeper wisdom. The artistic traditions that emerged from voyaging cultures continue to evolve as contemporary Pacific Island artists draw inspiration from navigation themes and techniques. Modern works incorporate traditional motifs while exploring how ancient wisdom applies to contemporary experiences. These artistic expressions help preserve and transmit cultural knowledge while making it accessible to new audiences who might not otherwise encounter traditional navigation concepts. The linguistic preservation efforts associated with traditional navigation have revealed the sophisticated technical vocabularies that different Pacific cultures developed for describing ocean phenomena. These specialized languages demonstrate how environmental expertise requires precise terminology for communicating about complex natural processes. The preservation of navigation languages contributes to broader efforts to maintain linguistic diversity, while documenting unique ways of understanding and describing the natural world. The research methodologies developed for studying traditional navigation have influenced approaches to documenting other endangered knowledge systems. The recognition that traditional techniques often embody sophisticated understanding that may not be immediately apparent to outside observers has led to more respectful and systematic approaches to working with indigenous communities. These methodological innovations benefit efforts to preserve and understand traditional knowledge in fields ranging from medicine to agriculture to environmental management. The technological applications of traditional navigation principles continue to expand as researchers discover new ways to apply ancient insights to modern challenges. Computer algorithms based on traditional pattern recognition methods show promise for improving artificial intelligence systems. Sensor networks designed according to traditional principles of environmental monitoring provide more robust and reliable data collection than conventional approaches. These applications demonstrate that traditional knowledge systems can inform cutting-edge technological development. The global recognition of traditional navigation as a significant human achievement has contributed to broader appreciation of indigenous knowledge systems and their relevance for contemporary challenges. International organizations increasingly acknowledge that traditional cultures have developed sophisticated solutions to problems that modern society is only beginning to understand. This recognition supports efforts to preserve and revitalize traditional knowledge while creating opportunities for meaningful collaboration between indigenous and scientific communities. As sleep carries you deeper into rest, let your mind drift with the eternal currents that guided those ancient voyagers. Feeling the rhythm of waves that connect all shores in the endless circulation of water, that has carried dreams and hopes across vast distances since the first humans looked toward the horizon and wondered what lay beyond the edge of the known world, following the star paths that lead through the deepest darkness toward the light of understanding that shines within every soul brave enough to trust the wisdom of wind and wave, and the ancient knowledge that flows like an underground river through all the generations of those who have learned to read the secret language written in the patterns of sea and sky. The story of these remarkable navigators reminds us that human potential extends far beyond the boundaries we typically accept. Their achievements demonstrate what becomes possible when systematic observation, dedicated training, and cultural wisdom combine to address the greatest challenges our world can offer. In their ability to find tiny islands across vast expanses of seemingly empty ocean, we see reflected our own capacity to navigate the uncertain waters of existence, guided by the subtle signs and patterns that surround us always, waiting to be noticed by those patient enough to learn their language and brave enough to trust their guidance toward whatever distant shores await our discovery in the endless ocean of possibility that stretches beyond every horizon we can imagine.